Representative Finch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members of the body. Thank you for your patience while we deliberated. As a Rules Committee, there was a lot of discussion and back and forth between different members of the committee about the measure. The underlying bill is a bill about the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It features a number of provisions, but all are linked by the common thread that they are necessitated by the pandemic or in direct response to the pandemic. Many of them expire upon the expiration of the state's disaster declaration. I think without exception, almost all of them either have their nexus in the first date of the disaster, March 12th of 2020, and many of them expire no later than January 26th. I think the latest may be March of 2021. The amendment which we are invited to consider is the permanent expansion of the state's public health care system through Medicaid expansion. It had been argued in our committee that that was health care and COVID is a disease, and thus the bill relates to health care, and so it should be germane. However, this bill would expand access to those benefits not just for the duration of the disaster, not just to those who have been affected by the disaster, but to any qualifying person under the terms of the bill permanently. For this reason, the majority of the committee does not believe that there are 2 points of contact, that really what has been presented here is a separate and distinct proposition, a standalone bill, which can be considered on its own merits, and which does not have sufficient points of contact for it to be germane to an underlying bill about the state's specific response to a specific disease pandemic and a specific disaster that has, for the most part, most or all of its provisions, I'll say most of its provisions, time limited. Mr. Speaker, your committee, your Rules Chair, finds that the amendment is not germane.
If the ruling is not germane, Representative Ward, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say I'm shocked, but having watched the contortions of the Rules Chair for the last 4 years avoid a debate on Medicaid expansion, I expected it. If you looked at the bill, the first line says the purpose of this bill is to provide certain relief related to health, welfare, property, and economic security. The second point of contact is one of the big buckets is $1.2 billion of CARES Act. A significant portion of that is expending money on health care as related to the first sentence in this bill. Now, the Rules Committee Chair said, well, wait a minute, this is all temporary. Well, you know it's not, because you heard the dialogue with the representative from Wichita, the ranking, where certain parts of the bill are permanent, like the products liability parts of the bill are permanent, okay? And he says, and providing health care to unemployed workers is a critical way we can provide relief to COVID-19 long term. I think because of that, just what, Tom, are you going to speak? Yeah. Will you make the request, or do you want me to make the request? Yeah. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would challenge the ruling of the chair.
The ruling of the chair has been challenged. I'll remind the body that this is a debatable motion and is only debatable by the following people: the member making the motion is Representative Ward. The member carrying the motion is Representative Patton. The majority leader designates the majority leader, and the minority leader represents the minority leader. Each member is limited to 2 minutes. Representative Ward. Representative Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the bill that we're debating has a lot of different things in it, a lot of stuff. But the one common thing is they're all ways to respond to the COVID crisis, which is a health crisis. The amendment provides health insurance to people that don't have health coverage. To me, that is a valid response to a health crisis in two ways. One, you got people that don't have health insurance that get COVID. This provides them coverage. But the second point of contact is most people get their health insurance through their jobs. And again, because of the COVID crisis, a lot of people have lost their jobs and therefore lost their health insurance. So this, like many other things in this bill, is a valid response to the COVID crisis in two important ways. I think it meets the 2 points of contact. It's another valid response to the COVID crisis, just like the many, many other things in this bill. There's a lot of things in this bill. The thing they have in common is valid responses to the COVID crisis. So I would urge you to vote to not sustain the ruling of the chair.
Representative Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The carrier of the maker of the motion to overrule didn't finish his sentence. He did get part of it right. It says, providing certain relief related to health, welfare, property, and economic security during this public health emergency. That means it ends. And everybody knows, without a doubt, that Medicaid expansion will never end. It'll keep going on. My question is, and it's one thing that during the debate, if I would have got up, I would have asked, wow, you are predicting that 200 or 220,000 people would now be on Medicaid expansion. How much does that cost? Our governor, back during the debate, said that it was going to cost $35 million, but I can tell you 5 years ago when I started debating this, it was $65 million. So it went from 65 to 35, which I never believed. If you're going to double the size, right now she's saying 35 million, you got to double it to 70 million. We had another one of my colleagues, or our colleagues from Sedgwick County, said, we're broke. If we're broke, how are we going to take care of that cost? Body, I ask you to vote this down. It's the right thing to do. Our rules committee, our rules chair, has done nothing but yeoman's work throughout his tenure. And you cannot look at what they do when they deliberate and say that they are doing anything more than calling balls and strikes. They do not look at the politics of it. They call balls and strikes. And they call balls and strikes today, and I say we uphold our rules chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to comment on the Majority Leader. COVID-19 doesn't have an expiration date. A lot of the healthcare concerns caused by the disease are lifelong. It affects your lungs, it affects your heart. If it doesn't kill you, it has long-term effects. So the idea that I wish we did have an expiration date, and I wish it was tomorrow. I wish it wasn't an hour from now. But to say that there's some sort of expiration date and therefore we don't need health care stretches logic. And I'm not going, I've known the Rules Committee chair since he walked into this chamber. We worked together on the Judiciary Committee on several bills. It's not personal. I just think that he uses the rules. I want to remind you, there was an amendment on this floor on a bill that had been amended before about Medicaid, and he declared the amendment that took out the other amendment on Medicaid non-germane because Medicaid expansion is a topic that the majority party doesn't want to talk. And I think that's not true. A part of the majority party doesn't want to do it. Last thing, I want to remind you about the rules, because today they're sacrosanct and we've got to be very narrow in our interpretation. But just a week ago, tell you the rules that we didn't use. The board was put on video, and contrary to the rules, it said you shall not take any photographic evidence of the board. We had multiple bills in conference committees, multiple bills that had subjects that at least one body had not voted on. The midnight rule. And of course, we had no written copies of the bills that we passed. This is a question about whether or not you're willing to step up today and help 175,000 Kansans who are suffering without health insurance and a healthcare industry that is just struggling very greatly. With that, I hope you vote to overrule the Rules Committee chair and vote on Medicaid expansion today.
As a reminder, a yes vote will sustain the ruling of the chair. A no vote will overturn the ruling. The question arises, shall the chairperson ruling be sustained? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. No. The ayes appear to have it. Division has been requested. The clerk will open the roll. If you're in your offices, please come forward.
15 hands that want a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, this is a roll call vote.
We do have someone coming.
I do. Susan. Has every member had the opportunity to vote? The clerk will close the roll. Does any member desire to change their vote? Seeing none, 76 voted in favor, 43 against. The ruling of the chair is sustained. We're back on the bill. Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment.
Amendment appears long. Would you mind explaining your amendment? Actually, it's short. The clerk will read.
It's brief, yeah. Short. Yeah. Don't need short jokes. I always have to stand like that when I'm
Page
here
6,
anyway.
striking all on lines 39 through 43 by striking all pages 7 through 9. On page 10 by striking all on lines 1 through 12. On page 49 and line 41 by striking 33 and inserting 25. Renumber sections accordingly. On page 1 in the title in line 11 by striking all after the semicolon, by striking lines 12 through 15 and line 16 by striking all before enacting.
Representative, you mind explaining your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this amendment, it will remove the liability immunity piece from the bill. Can I continue? This should have come to us in a separate bill, quite honestly. There are too many subjects that have been shoved into this one piece of legislation. This immunity protection is totally unnecessary. If a business is following all of the guidance from CDC, from KDHE, there is no case. A lawsuit would be thrown out. It would not advance forward. Now, if a business is not following the guidance to create a safe work environment, then they should be held liable. Our judicial system works, and it has the necessary checks in place. As I said the last time that we considered this measure, this is the number 2 issue in the district that I represent. The residents and constituents I represent have made it very clear to me that they do not support liability protection for business. They think that provides a disincentive to ensure a safe workplace environment. Many of my neighbors and constituents are the essential workers that are keeping this economy going. They are the workers that are delivering groceries and medicine to those that are fortunate enough to be able to work from home or stay home because they can afford to or retired. Many of my constituents are afraid. They are faced with difficult choices to stay home and stay safe or to go to work to provide for their family. Not all work environments are safe. This has been the number 2 constituent issue that I have tried to help people with behind unemployment for the past 3 months. Complaints ranging from employers not notifying employees of exposure to COVID-19, they often find out word of mouth. Preventive deep cleaning or deep cleaning not being done after a case has been identified. The most common is not providing PPE, masks, gloves, plastic shields, or requiring customers to social distance and wear masks. We've all received emails today from businesses that have said that they should get immunity from liability because they can't buy or purchase the PPE that's needed To me, that demonstrates exactly why we should not have the liability protection. Wyandotte County has been hit hard with COVID-19. It is one of the highest number of cases in the state, along with those counties with meat processing plants. I realize that we do not all share the same experience in dealing with this pandemic. Those of us in areas that have been hit the hardest, it's much different than those areas where there are no cases or very few cases. I ask that you try to please put yourself in the shoes of those that have to make those tough decisions between staying safe, keeping your family safe and protected from COVID-19, and providing the necessities of life, food and a roof over your head. We should be doing all we can to protect those workers and giving them the confidence that we will not tolerate practices that will put their lives at risk. And with that, I will be happy to stand for questions.
Representative Hodge.
Will the carrier of the amendment stand for question? Thank you. You mentioned that your amendment was short. Is that right?
I'm sorry?
Your amendment was short. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Exactly how does it eliminate the quote-unquote liability piece of the underlying bill?
It strikes that whole section out of the bill.
And your concern is, can you briefly explain a situation where an employee would benefit from your position as opposed to the way the bill is already set up?
Well, I think what I've heard from my constituents is that they do not want us to provide protection from immunity because they think businesses then will get lax in what they are providing as far as making a safe work environment. And there's already remedies in the law, so it's really unnecessary to provide a business immunity for this.
I think that's worth asking a question about. You mentioned this, there's already remedies. What do you mean by that?
Well, business already has a protection in that if a suit was brought and they have followed all of the guidance that has been offered, then that suit would not move forward. It would be thrown out. It's only if a business has not followed the guidance and has not created a safe work environment that suit would be able to move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Representative. I commend the representative for bringing this and having the foresight to think about this. There is something that we know of, and it's called the court system, and I don't mean to be trite about that. When you have a cause of action, you have to prove that the cause of action should go forward. One of those elements is going to be proving that you
Is that okay?
you acquired the virus at a negligent employer. Those standards of care, those standards already exist. We don't need to lessen those. If we do that, I believe the representative's predictions would become a probability, because if they know that their liability is lessened, then maybe they won't be taking care of their employees as much as they were. Again, what she's trying to tell us is that there are already standards in the law that employers and everyone for that matter has to adhere to. If we are negligent, if we are negligent to a degree that requires culpability or liability, excuse me, I'm mixing my terms there, liability, that's up for a judge to decide. If a judge would decide that a certain business didn't adhere to reasonable safety standards, that's a question for jury. That's a question for a court. And I have full confidence that if someone has a cause of action, that's going to be, one, it's going to be pretty difficult to prove where a person acquired the virus, and two, whether or not the business was negligent to a standard where they're liable. So I want us to really think about that, because I think the representative's right. We are changing standards of care that already exist. We don't need to make it easier to take advantage of folks who are making $7.25 an hour. I mean, every time I drive through the McDonald's drive-through, and I'm being serious here, I can't believe that these folks are seeing person after person after person in that drive-through, and we're going to lessen that standard of care that, in that example, that fast food chain would owe those people making fairly close to minimum wage. So we should probably think about this clearly. And I support the representative's efforts here. Thank you.
Representative Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment. Throughout the COVID-19 crisis, I've been meeting by Zoom conference with business leaders in my area, talking with constituents, friends, and neighbors. And across the industries that I hear from, and we saw as this bill came together, they are all asking for some sort of protection to reopen, especially small local business officers is who I've been talking with, our restaurants, our hair and nail salons, our local retailers of home decor, you name it, our gym owners. And they are asking for some protection for their businesses to remain viable. Our businesses provide jobs for our communities. They're where we want to live. They're why we want to live where we live. And they deserve some help in reopening. And I say that because we have never before in our jurisprudence asked a business to bear the burden, bear the duty of keeping customers who come in from picking up an airborne disease or illness, if you will. And this bill, the amendment would change that duty of care. And I don't mean to get into the weeds about the process, but if these businesses are exposed to what I would say in some instances would be frivolous lawsuits, it's just the process of defending those lawsuits that will bankrupt our businesses. And our businesses, they are us. They are real people, real business owners who have that business. They put their blood, sweat, and tears into that business to provide for their family. Their employees work there to put food on the employees' table. And if a business is not following the guidelines and the directives out there, then they can bear some risk of their bad behavior. So I stand in opposition to the amendment, and I ask that you vote it down. Thank you.
Representative Carmichael on the amendment for the first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the first and last time on the amendment. Come on. All the law requires of a business is that they follow a duty of reasonable care. Do what a reasonable person would do under the same or similar circumstances. We don't need to change the tort law. Who in their right mind on a jury or even a lawyer who wants to make a living is going to go out and try to file some frivolous lawsuit over COVID? That's ridiculous. All you got to do is do what a reasonable person would do under the same or similar circumstances. That's all the law requires of any of us. And COVID doesn't change that. Yes, it is an airborne virus. That doesn't matter. It's only when the business fails to observe the standards of reasonable care that a business has any potential or possible liability. In addition, as we discussed with the chairman some time ago, you can't take away people's vested rights for claims that have already arisen, meaning it's unconstitutional to impose or provide for immunity for acts that have already taken place in the past. You can't change the law going backwards. And if you want to change the law going forwards to eliminate causes of action which are guaranteed under the Fifth Amendment to the Kansas Constitution, or actually Section 5, they're not amendments, but our Bill of Rights, Section 5, you got to provide at a minimum, if you're going to deny a jury trial, and it's arguable whether you can get away with it at all anymore after the Hilburn decision, but at a minimum, you've got to provide an adequate quid pro quo. If you're going to take away somebody's rights, you got to give them something in exchange. And that's why you can't go picking out businesses that you like and businesses that you don't like and saying, we're going to give immunity to doctors, but we're not going to give the same immunity to nursing homes. You can't say we're going to give immunity to doctors, but not lawyers. That makes no sense. It's a denial of due process. It's a denial of equal protection. It's contrary to the Constitution. Why don't we clean this bill up, take these immunity provisions out, offer a new bill first thing tomorrow morning, send it over to the Judiciary Committee, and I'm sure we can get busy on some hearings, and maybe we can come up with a way to constitutionally do what the folks in favor of this immunity would like. I therefore support this amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I speak in support of the immunity provisions contained within this legislation just for a couple of reasons, most specifically. The immunity sections here bring a level of stability to our economic recovery moving forward that is necessary. Our businesses need that piece of stability. They need that certainty to understand that in these particular circumstances, I think we've all known that as this matter proceeds, what we understand and know about this virus has changed. It changes. It has evolved. We are finding some things are more important, other things are not as important in terms of the actions that we take in that regard, which by its definition will move around a standard of care, if you will, in terms of what a reasonable person would do. Yes, certainly courts can sort through those things, but in the meantime, until those matters arrive at courts, it brings a level of uncertainty, a level of instability to the economic climate in general that we don't need right now for these businesses during a defined period of time. So in that regard, for the purpose of bringing that some level of stability in that regard to our economic climate, I stand in support of the immunity provisions and would oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Patton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to talk about the merits of leaving this in or not. I certainly believe that these provisions are something we should keep in. I'm going to talk about the compromise and the hours, literally hours, that went back and forth between the governor's office and the Senate trying to come up with the exact language that everyone would agree to pass and agree to sign. And the liability piece is the one that I was most involved in, and I can assure you that darn near every word was looked at and changed or tweaked or analyzed and justified. And it's a big piece of making sure it passes the other chamber, and it's something that the governor would sign. So as I'm likely to do on every amendment that might be brought, I'm going to get up and encourage you not to support the amendment because we need to hold this deal together. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, Representative Curtis, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of, thank you, sorry. Just to address a couple of the thoughts that came up. One is, if a business is doing the things that they need to do, following the guidance, they already have that protection. They don't need this. This is totally unnecessary. The other thing is that the governor, in meeting with her earlier today, she actually said that she did not like this piece of the legislation. So this is not something that I think that the governor is supportive of. This strips away the protection from negligence, and it just totally ignores the safety of Kansas workers. And I understand giving business some assurances, but I think that that is totally misunderstood. If they're following the guidance that's issued, they already have those assurances. The assurances are create a safe workplace. Do what you're supposed to do to prevent your employees, your customers, and yourself from getting this awful coronavirus. And that's what's needed. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I move my amendment.
You've heard the motion by Representative Curtis to amend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Division has been requested. Roll call has been requested. Seeing well over 15 hands is in order. The clerk will open the roll. You may record your vote. Any members in their offices wish to vote, they can come in now. Has every member had the opportunity to vote? The clerk will close the roll. Does any member wish to change their vote? See none. 38 voted in favor, 81 against. The amendment fails. Back on the bill. Representative Riley.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment.
The amendment appears short. The clerk will read.
on page 57, following line 4, by inserting new section 40. A, notwithstanding any of the other provision of law, an agency that regularly conducts inspections in the state of Kansas, whether online or on site, shall not conduct any such inspection until January 1, 2020, unless the entity being inspected requests such an inspection. B, any entity which is regulated in the state of Kansas and is required to be inspected, whether online or on site, to remain in good standing, shall have any current valid license or certification issued by the state extended without being inspected until January 1, 2020, and renumber sections accordingly.
Representative, you want to explain your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. On the tail of the amendment that we just heard in the discussion, this should be short. During the last couple months, mainly the regulatory agencies have been doing online inspections, and now we're back into a short period of time where I think this is a great time when we can help out businesses by continuing keeping the regulations and the regulatory agencies off of small businesses until January 1. So basically what this amendment does is that it adds that the regulatory agencies will not do on-site or online inspections unless they are requested by business. And so even during the off period of time, the last couple months, we've had people call in and request to continue on their certificates and their licensures for their buildings, to continue doing inspections, everything from fire marshals to different things, basically via online. So here we are. We have had executive orders where we have extended out to car license renewals, income tax payments, property tax payments. This would be an easy process, and it would save businesses a small amount of money, and in the long run, it would also save the state a lot of money, because not having the transportation costs, the hourly time for people to go out on site, and we talk about being short on funds and looking forward into the next few months of being short on funds, July 1st through December, being short on funds. This is a good way of saving some money for the state. This is a good way to take some of that regulatory pressure until January 1, 2021 off of small businesses. In addition to that, it also says that certificates and licenses, everybody from the barbershops, salons, those licenses are going to be extended on until January 1st, 2021. So it takes the pressure off of them of having to get renewing all of their licenses and certificates. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will stand for questions.
Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the carrier stand for a couple of questions? Thank you. Would your amendment apply to nursing homes?
Yes.
Would it apply to hospitals?
Yes.
Restaurants?
Yes.
Thank you. I understand the intent behind this, but this is far, far too broad for us to pass without any vetting. It could have enormous consequences for our public health and safety. I would encourage you to vote against it. Thank you.
Representative Hodge.
Would the carrier of the amendment stand for a question?
Yes, sir.
What restaurant would you recommend during this time to attend? Every one of them?
Yes. In Kansas.
Okay. How would you know what nursing home to admit your aging parents to during this time?
I do have in-laws and parents in that situation, and I trust that those folks are doing a great job.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the carrier of the amendment stand for question?
Yes, ma'am.
Would this also apply to abortion clinics?
It would.
Thank you.
Representative Patton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I certainly think it's good over time that we look at what regulations are necessary on businesses and what we're charging them for inspections, I do not think this is a good amendment. In the bill itself, it mandates inspections on nursing homes, so we're adding inspections in this bill to make sure nursing homes are in compliance. We don't understand the financial implications of this. How would this interplay with the immunity pieces that we have in this bill? And then my standard default answer, we have a compromise bill with the governor and with the Senate, and we don't want to tinker with that and lose that fragile compromise we have. So I would encourage you to vote no on this amendment. Thank you.
Any other member wish to speak to this amendment? Seeing none, Representative, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, what better way to go into your local elections saying that you're supporting businesses, trusting your businesses, knowing that you're going to extend out their certificates and licenses so that they won't have that pressure, knowing that they're not going to have regulatory agencies in the next 6 months, 7 months, trying to do little nitpicky things now that they're just trying to recover. Mr. Speaker, I move my amendment.
You've heard the motion. All in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. The ayes. Motion fails. The body is stand at ease. Representative Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to take a quick minute here. In our last session, when it was 24 hours, I really wish I had stepped up. I was so tired, though, in the middle of the morning when we were all waxing about how nice it was to be here. I just didn't have the heart to come up and really express my gratitude for serving in this house and serving with each and every one of you. Over the last 4 years, it's been a true enriching experience, eye-opening, and so I thank each and every one of you I've served with up here. And with that, I do have an amendment.
Member that appears long, would like to describe your amendment?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I'm calling this a small technical clarification. It's an additive piece to the current bill. What that means is it doesn't change the language per se of any section, but adds a small bit to the end of it. And that section specifically deals with correction workers in our state. I realize we've talked about liability a lot. I'm supportive of giving some of these businesses, et cetera, good liability protection. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with workers' compensation. This has to do with essential workers that have gone into prisons specifically and done their job. I know in my area we were on the top 13th hotspot, primarily due to the maybe 800-900 prisoners, inmates that were infected with the COVID, as well as the 100 or so infected officers. Unfortunately, as you well know, a couple of officers died in the last month. Going to those officers and having their spouses come out, just afraid for their own sake, not being able to spend their time with their loved ones, as they saw their loved ones die or heard about their loved ones dying in the hospitals. Obviously, that's heartbreaking to hear about. We've heard that story over and over again. These are our state workers. These are correction workers that went in and often did overtime for 80 to 100 hours when I talked with them. These are guys and gals going in there and doing their essential job in an environment which we know had a lack of PPE, had challenges with their medical evaluation of the COVID virus at the time, but they still went in there and did their duty for us to keep our state safe. This small amendment, what it does is, and it has a sunset of May of 2021, it clarifies the fact that if an officer or a correction worker who's had contact with inmates in the state of Kansas dies, if they die, we clearly specify that their family is available to receive that workman's compensation for death in the line of duty. There are further actions we should take from a CAPER standpoint that one of my colleagues pointed out to me this afternoon. I fully support that. But the families deserve that. The bill or the amendment basically gives the presumption that the COVID, if it's present and they died with those complications, that they did die of the virus and they do deserve that compensation, and it's presumptive. One could argue, did they get that virus outside of the prison? One could argue that, but when the infection rate is 20 to 30 to 100 times higher in that environment, and they're in there for these 40 to 80 hours a week, it does not take much to understand where they picked that up and why they died, doing their duty to our state. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, that's a brief summary of what this amendment would do.
Is there objection to waiving the reading of the amendment? There is objection. The clerk will read.
Page 57, following line 11 by inserting section 41, KSA 2019 sub 44 5A01 is hereby amended to read as follows. A, where the employer and the employee worker are subject by law or election to the provisions of the Workers' Compensation Act, the disablement or death of an employee or worker resulting from an occupational disease as defined in this section shall be treated as the happening of an injury by accident, and the employee or worker, or in the case of death, the employee's or worker's dependent shall be entitled to compensation for such disablement or death resulting from an occupational disease in accordance with the provisions of the Workers' Compensation Act, as in cases of injuries by accident that are compensable thereunder, except as specifically provided otherwise for occupational diseases, including as provided for the occupational disease of COVID-19 pursuant to subsection G. In no circumstances shall an occupational disease be construed to include injuries caused by repetitive trauma as defined in KSA 44508 and amendments thereto. B, occupational disease means only a disease arising out of and in the course of the employment resulting from the nature of the employment in which the employee was engaged under such employer, and that was actually contracted while so engaged, except as provided by subsection G. Nature of the employment means, for purposes of this section, that to the occupation, trade, or employment in which the employee was engaged, there is attached a particular and peculiar hazard of such disease that distinguishes the employment from other occupations and employments, and that creates a hazard of such disease that is in excess of the hazard. Such disease is general, except as provided by subsection G. The disease must appear to have had its origin in a special risk of such disease connected with a particular type of
Objection's been
employment.
raised. Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to say I share having a pleasurable experience over the last number of years with my colleague here in the House. He's a good guy. And he brings this amendment with heart for what occurred at this point with two correctional supervisors at Lansing State Penitentiary. The fact of the matter is, the virus issue is not yet done. There are public safety officers involved in public employee retirement covered positions such as highway patrolmen, deputies, police officers from across the state. And some, oddly enough, COVID-related exposures under work comp have been approved through work comp proceedings, but it's a pretty steep hill to climb in order to have that approved. We heard earlier that generally disease that is present among the public and not as a work-related causation unique to the place are not covered under work comp, or words to that effect. What I would suggest is that I support the concept, and it needs a look. And I will be the first one to commit, and since I'm not opposed in a primary or a general, I will be here next year. I will be the one that drafts a bill to seek to address what these folks have experienced and what their families are experiencing, whether it be through a work comp process or assuring that appropriate remuneration is made to the family through the CAPERS retirement system. So for today, I'm going to ask that we not get too emotionally involved in this. I frankly am a little myself. This is the field I worked in. I ran a facility. I know what these guys are facing every day on a good day, and they haven't had a good day since March. I mean, really, they haven't had a good day in about 8 years. But I think we need to take a very careful look at this and keep in mind that the corrections officers in the institutions are not the only employees that are covered under government workers' compensation or retirement that we need to be thinking about. And unfortunately, it's quite likely these two folks will not be the last ones that subject themselves to the risk and make that kind of sacrifice. So I'm going to ask for your indulgence and not support the amendment at this time, with the promise you will hear about this issue in January. Thank you. With respect.
Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment, believe it or not. I appreciate the representatives bringing this to our attention. Like him, I have talked to many of our correction officers in Lansing, and I don't think any of us would walk into that environment that they have to walk into every single day. We owe them so much, and I appreciate what the chairman of the Corrections Committee just said. We have a lot of work to do to compensate these correction officers for the amount of danger and threats that they go through every day for us. So I'm going to support this amendment. I think we've got a lot of work to do in corrections next year to add to it, but I'm going to go ahead and support it. I think we need to make sure that those two officers that were unfortunate enough to succumb to this disease are adequately compensated, and any others that might also come down with it. We're very lucky. They just completed the testing of all the other staff members at the Lansing Correction Facility, and only 15 more were diagnosed as being had COVID. So again, I support the amendment. If you all want to take care of it now, that'd be great, or otherwise we'll take care of it next year in the Corrections Committee. Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Speaker.
Seeing no further discussion, Representative, you may close.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to my esteemed colleagues who have come up. You know, I hope I can work on it as well. Hopefully I have the fortune to also draft that on the other chamber so we can co-sponsor that particular piece of legislation, because these workers do put their lives on the line for us. One could argue, hey, this is just the opening, the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak, of people coming up. This is very specific to people who have died with COVID, our neighbors. This is a concentrated environment where there is no escape and there was no ventilation. It's tragic. I want to make sure you understand this does have some retroactivity back to January, so it will cover those that have already passed, and there is a finishing time of May 2021. You know, I know that this bill that we're working on, the underlying bill, has sensitivity to it. This is a small clarification. It does not change the nature of this. I cannot see in my heart of hearts how anybody would take this provision that we're adding into this, something that might have been overlooked because it's so small in the grand scheme of things, and yet it's so important to two particular families. I cannot see how that would stop this process and this bill from being passed in either chamber or being signed by the governor. I don't find that to be a valid argument in this case, and I do hope that you'll support the amendment. If nothing else, keep the families in your heart and offer a prayer for them. Thank you, and I move my amendment.
You've heard the motion by Representative Pittman to amend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. No. The noes appear to have it. Division has been requested. The clerk will open the roll. Seeing 15 hands, a roll call is in order.
Twitter, he's supposed to be, well, he's supposed to be quarantining, and so he came in from. Yeah. So
Has every member had the opportunity to vote? The clerk will close the roll. Does any member wish to change their vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? 57 yes, 63 no. The motion fails. Back on the bill. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To pick up where I left off, I was inquiring of our chairman, I believe, about the letter that he and I received from the executive director, the president, and the legislative chair of the Board of Healing Arts, who raised serious questions and said that this legislation, among other things, under subsection H, absent criminal activity, no Kansas authority would have the jurisdiction to regulate the practice of these individuals being out-of-state physicians who are allowed to come here and practice. And so I appreciate the chairman had to refer to other members, but where are we at? Did we fix this problem that was so severe that the Board of Healing Arts wrote us this letter saying, please don't do it this way, and made multiple suggestions as to what we needed to do to fix the legislation so that out-of-state physicians cannot come here and practice without any regulation whatsoever?
There we go. The bill has not been amended after receiving that letter, but I know we did discuss it. Members on our side who have connections to that industry looked at it, and again, the language comes straight from the governor's executive order, and so we're simply putting the governor's executive order in place. We believe that the physicians would, while not be regulated by the Kansas board, they would be regulated by their own board, whichever state they come from. And we also heard, at least in our calendar, that in some areas of the state, these physicians have been greatly needed to respond to shortages in staff. And so no amendment was made because, again, we went back to the fact this came straight out of the governor's executive order.
Thank you. I don't care whether it's the governor's executive order or not. We need to do the right job here. And I'm sorry that nobody wanted to amend this legislation that got cooked up last night, but this is a serious 4-page letter from the Board of Healing Arts. The president of the board, Dr. Gould, it says acting executive director, but I think he's now the executive director and general counsel, Tucker Poling, and Kimberly Templeton, MD, the chair of the legislative committee. And they wrote to us and laid out specifically things that need to be changed for this health and safety of Kansans, but it appears that this has also been discarded. I'm not going to go on with all the things that are wrong with the bill, but I would like to see if we could at least make it a little bit better. You recall that we had a discussion about immunity and the fact you can't take away people's rights without giving them something in return. And you'll recall the chairman and I were somewhat uncertain as to whether or not people who contract COVID-19 on the job will be covered by workers' compensation. And of course, you know from this immunity legislation that we're doing our dead level best to make sure that people who've been injured because of the negligence or fault of manufacturers offshore, whatever country they may be from, that they're all protected. But maybe we at least, oh, and by the way, I know we don't have inclination this year to take care of the families of our corrections employees who've literally given their lives for our health and safety. We say we'll get around to that next year because we're busy tonight with something else, I guess. But at least here's one proposal that might help. I think the best thing to do at this point is to say, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment.
Would you like to explain your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is somewhat similar to what the representative from Leavenworth brought us a little while ago, except that this is much, much broader in scope. This amendment would bring any Kansas worker who contracts COVID under the provisions of the Workers' Compensation Act unless the employer shows that it was not contracted at work. It creates what is known as a rebuttable presumption that individuals contracting COVID contracted it at work. If the employer presents evidence that says, no, this employee wasn't at work, this employee wasn't exposed to anyone with it, we don't have any history of COVID here. In fact, the matter is they were with some distinguished Kansas legislators down at Lake of the Ozarks a weekend or so ago for a, what kind of a party, whatever it is, then they won't be held liable. But otherwise, if we're going to give immunity to all of the doctors and businesses and importers and exporters, let's give working Kansas something. And what we can give them is we can bring them within the protection of the Workers' Compensation Act, and we'll protect Kansas employers because of the exclusive remedy rule, meaning that immunity follows liability, will make the employer liable, and as a result, will make the employer immune, and we won't need to worry about how we treat one category of business as opposed to another. So that's what my amendment is, Mr. Speaker.
Is there objection to waiving the reading of the amendment? Representative Carmack, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm hopeful that we won't have to break the midnight rule tonight, and based on what happened to the representative from Leavenworth's bill, I suspect I know the fate of this one. But somebody needs to stand up for the rights of working Kansans who've contracted this disease at work, because we're giving immunity to everybody else, but we're not giving anything to Kansas workers, and this would fix that. Thank you.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple of questions for the carrier of the amendment.
Hello? Are you there? There we are. How can I be of assistance, sir?
This amendment, does it change any of the HIPAA rules of the healthcare facilities?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Does it address any kind of HIPAA regulations?
So far as I know, this has nothing to do with HIPAA.
Does it address Americans for Disabilities Act and the protections that are given to the employees?
This has nothing to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act. This has to do with Kansas workers' compensation law.
Well, I would argue that it would, because if you're going to have an employer have to prove to a court that they did not contract the disease at their place of employment, how are they supposed to do that if they can't have access to medical records?
Well, it's actually the same as any other workers' compensation case. When an employee files a claim for workers' compensation benefits, number one, Kansas law provides that their privilege to prevent the disclosure of health care information is waived by the filing of that claim. Number two, the HIPAA regulations make specific provisions for workers' compensation claims, and in fact, the Director of Workers' Compensation has promulgated a standard form order that is used in all cases, whether they are occupational disease cases or whether they are traumatic injury cases, that permits the employer to obtain all of the medical records of the claimant, to interview the claimant's doctors, to take depositions, and to require the employee to submit to medical examinations. That's well-established law.
So they can get all their current medical records?
I'm sorry?
They can get all their current medical records under that?
They can only do what? I'm sorry.
They can get all their current medical records under that?
They can get their current, their past, and their current records. There are some exceptions that if you want to obtain psychological records or records involving drug testing and addiction, that you have to go to the court and make a specific showing of a need for that type of information.
Okay, let's talk about the people that went to the Ozarks. You brought this up in your
Yes.
argument. So let's say an employee of mine goes to the Ozarks and he comes back. He was in that pool with hundreds of people. He comes back to my business and within 2 weeks contracts COVID-19. How am I supposed to prove that he got it at the pool rather than at my work?
Well, if he died at the pool, you will find his body floating there.
So if he contracted the disease in the Ozarks and 14 days later he's got the disease and he's working for me, how am I to prove that he got it at the Ozarks if he's still alive?
Oh, okay. Well, you just simply put on the evidence that here he was, not observing any social distancing, that he was drinking, that he was hugging the girls, he was having a wonderful time. You establish that that is a major cluster. You establish that at your business, nobody contracted COVID, that you don't have any cases except for this employee who was partying down at Lake of the Ozarks. At that point, you've rebutted the presumption and defeated the claim.
Let's suppose that that employee worked for me part-time and had 2 other part-time jobs. Which employer would have to cover that claim?
Now you're talking about the concept of joint employment, and that is a very complicated question under Kansas workers' compensation law. For example, we deal with that problem with folks who have repetitive use injuries. If you work at the meatpacking plant and then you moonlight as a mechanic twisting wrenches, then there are always questions about where did this occur. This does not change that. That is an issue of proof that has to be considered in every case.
Well, if he got the disease, he had to get it at one place. He couldn't have gotten it at all 3. So how do you argue that out and figure that out?
Well, that's what I'm saying. The judges are familiar with how to do that. And in fact, we would probably then be looking back at the prevailing factor test to determine which employment contributed the most to the disease or the trauma.
So it would be up to a judge?
Pardon me?
It would be up to a judge in this hypothetical situation?
Well,
just like all your questions earlier?
Well, first, the vast majority of workers' compensation cases are settled because the idea is that folks will receive compensation without having to go through this process. But if an employer wants to fight the claim, then the first level is the administrative law judge, followed by an appeal to the Kansas Workers' Compensation Board of Appeals, followed by an appeal to the Kansas Court of Appeals, followed by a petition for review to the Kansas Supreme Court, just as in any other case.
2 last questions.
Okay.
Have you consulted with the insurance industry, the self-insured risk pool industry, on whether or not they're properly reserved for this exposure?
We, as a matter of fact, have not held hearings. If we were holding hearings, then we could ask those folks to come in and talk to us about that. But I'm looking for some form of regulatory certainty since, as the chairman explained, we have no idea whether these claims are or not covered as we stand here today.
So what do you think that this type of an amendment would do to, say, Tran or Spirit Aviation or Boeing or the Restaurant Association that have self-insured risk pools that aren't reserved for this type of a claim?
Well, as you well know, those self-insured pools also purchase reinsurance coverage so that when their reserves are insufficient to pay a claim, they then turn to the reinsurer. And in the event the reinsurer is also insolvent, then the Kansas Workers' Compensation Fund pays the money.
And so how are these companies supposed to afford, in today's world, how are they supposed to afford the increase in those premiums?
Well, the good news is they won't have to worry about civil liability for COVID-related claims. So the money that they save on their general liability insurance coverage can be applied against the workers' compensation premium.
All right, thank you very much
My
for
pleasure.
your time. Okay, guys, so as you can see, this irresponsible change to our carefully constructed workers' compensation laws would bring a lot of confusion to the industry. The proponents of this have been talking about it for quite some time, ever since California tried to do this. And none of them have spoken to the insurance industry or these self-insured risk pools to find out how much devastation it would cause. In fact, I asked the Secretary of Labor when she brought this up to me a few weeks ago if she had consulted any of these companies like Tran or Spirit Aviation or any insurance company for that matter, and the answer was no. They didn't even think of that. Well, let me explain to you real quick how insurance works. Insurance is basically you take a risk, a common risk that we all have, and you share it amongst all the policyholders. And there's actuaries that look at these policies or look at the claims, possible claims, and they come up with what it should cost to spread that risk out to thousands of different businesses, and then they sell an insurance policy to cover that. And so that's called reserving for a claim. And what this amendment is doing is adding a whole new risk that no one's ever accounted for to that risk pool. And every single workers' compensation plan will be under-reserved and will fail. That includes all the aviation companies in Wichita that are already struggling. That includes all the restaurants and all the restaurant associations that are already struggling, just so we can pay for somebody that got sick somewhere. Now, workers' compensation already responds to somebody that gets sick in the workplace as long as they can prove they got it there. What this amendment does is flip-flop that and make the business owner prove that he didn't get it there. That's very hard to prove. It's easy to prove if a worker contracts it. That's covered. They just have to have some documentation that they were exposed, and they'll get coverage. We have something like 75 pending cases in Kansas right now. 35 of them have already been covered, so there is coverage out there. But if you turn around and you make insurance companies pay for every single COVID claim for every worker in Kansas, no one's going to be able to afford workers' compensation. It's just a bad idea. Your schools, how are they going to pay for this? Property taxes are going to have to go down. Property values are going to go down because no one has jobs. So I would tell you to vote against this, and that's all I got. Thanks.
Seeing no further discussion, Representative McClose on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we don't want to get into a real deep discussion of insurance premiums, but you see, these employers have been paying a premium for years in anticipation that someday there may be claims made against them based upon contagious diseases. So if we take away their liability for these claims through immunity laws, then there is the premium that's out there, and I guess the proposal is that the insurance company just throws that benefit in its pocket and jacks the premium on the workers' compensation coverage. I appreciate the chairman of the Commerce Committee's explanation of how the insurance industry works. It's a pretty reprehensible deal. So I've said my piece. I suspect I know what you're going to do, and with that, I close and move my amendment.
You've heard the motion by Representative Carmichael to amend. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. No. Nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The motion fails. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have one quick question for the carrier of the bill. Earlier we were talking about local governments having the authority to lessen any statewide restrictions or recommendations, do they also have the ability to increase or heighten within this bill?
Yes, they currently have that authority under current law, and we're not changing that.
Okay, so they can adjust according to what they feel the best
Yes.
situation of their community is. Okay, thank you for that. And I do have an amendment. Bear with me, y'all.
Would you like to explain your amendment?
Sure. I've been contacted, like most of you, by constituents having issues with the unemployment benefits. And one of the situations I ran into was a constituent who unknowingly accepted a week's worth of unemployment benefits back in 2017. And due to current Kansas law, he's locked out for 5 years as a penalty because of that, even though his monies had already been repaid. And in this time of crisis where, households are getting broken and we got an anticipated second wave coming, these folks are still going to be locked out for that 5 years coming up. The executive orders cannot change this. And furthermore, what I've come across is it's complicating getting federal benefits to some of these individuals also. I looked into it, and the Department of Labor had introduced a bill last session. So I've taken that bill and put it into an amendment form, and it changes a couple of things from the day following the separation to the effective date of the claim, and that's on disqualifications for benefits. It changes some language where if you become injured or ill and you have to leave your job, you would no longer be eligible if you came back to that job and there was not a position to be had. So it would change the eligibility on that. And please bear with me, Body. We're on the fly right here. And it changed another effective date. But the main thing is it allows that lockout to be removed when penalties are repaid. And that's the point of it. I went ahead and added language that all these penalties would be waived if we are in a state of disaster due to an executive order related to COVID-19. With that, I try to stand for questions.
Is there objection to waiving the reading of the amendment? There's no objection. Is there discussion? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So while on the surface this bill or this amendment seems, okay, for the one or two people that are out there that somehow mysteriously accepted dollars for several weeks after they got their job and just forgot to let the state know that they got a job, or committed any kind of fraud, we have a rule for that. I mean, if you're going to commit fraud on a welfare program, you no longer qualify, and they suspend you for 5 years. I think this is a bad idea. I think it's a bad precedent to reduce it or just waive it just because of a disease. These people still committed a crime, and they knew what the penalty was, and it's now time to pay the price.
Representative Yeager.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to say to what was just said, this designation happened to my own husband. He has never committed fraud in his life, yet he had to deal with 5 years of he better not get laid off from the aircraft industry, which we all know gets hit by this, because this state decided to call him a fraud. Do you want to know what his sin was? He got paid an extra week as he went back to work, and during that week, And for 5 years, even though he immediately paid it back, he got called a fraud. There are a ton of people just like that. Not 20 minutes ago, I stepped out of this chamber because I received a phone call from someone that I've been working with through this entire thing. Her name is Michelle Tran. She has a family. She's lost her car. She's lost her home. Do you want to know why? Because this state decided to call her a fraud too over a week. There are a lot of people just like this. They did not ask for a pandemic. They did not ask for an executive order. What they asked for is representation. That's what we're here for, and I hope that you will stand with me and look out for these people. Thank you.
Seeing further discussion, Representative, you may close.
Like the previous speaker, I've been reached out to by multiple people, local business leaders as well, pleading for their employees that are currently locked out of this. You know, he said, I don't want you to waive any fees that they would owe, but, you know, under these circumstances, can't we do something for them? And then when I discovered that it's impactful upon getting federal benefits as well during these times, it's terrible for these people. And as the revisor wrote this up for me, he assured me that it wouldn't change any criminal charges. This would only change civils. And in the time of the executive order declaration of emergency, it would only suspend whatever penalty they had left until the disaster is resolved. So I don't see how this is bad for anybody's constituents. I don't claim to be an unemployment insurance expert, but I think that the people that have reached out to me and plead would appreciate your vote. So I move my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You've heard the motion by Representative Owsley to amend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Those appear to have it. Those do have it. The motion fails. Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment.
Would you like to explain?
Yes, of course I would. All right, so this amendment essentially, you know, as we heard, Executive Order 2010 sort of expired. That was the one dealing with evictions and foreclosures. And the reason why I decided to run this amendment was because, like many of you, I've been hearing from a lot of people who have been having issues with unemployment, specifically PUA funds. And so been thinking about a lot of the troubles that a lot of our small business owners have been facing, and they didn't ask for this. They are some of the hardest hit people. Some of them were just getting their payments last week. And so when I look at this amendment essentially what it does is that it sort of puts that executive order, or not that executive order, but the provisions regarding evictions and foreclosures back into place. It follows the same oversight terms as the underlying bill, so it expires on September 15th. After that, it's sort of subject to legislative approval, the same type as the underlying bill. So if you want an opportunity to provide some extended stability, especially for small business owners who are still hurting, who still do need some time to catch up, and for whom the stimulus checks are not quite enough, then this is your opportunity. And with that, I stand for questions.
Is there objection to the waiving the reading of the amendment? There's no objection. Any discussion? Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I try to make a habit of not coming down here very often, but I rise in support of this amendment. I represent a district that is quickly becoming a majority renter district. I think the previous speaker did a great job of talking about many of the problems that many of our folks are facing. This would put back into place the provisions to extend the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures through September, just like many of the other provisions would be extended. This just makes sense, and it would give people time to find a plan to come up with that missed rent and missed mortgage payments, including the fees that they're still responsible for. And I think that this would be some much needed relief and extending that rent and eviction and foreclosure relief that they all need. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So picture yourself as a small business owner that owns several houses or homes or an apartment complex, and you haven't received rent for the last 3 months. And now finally you can enforce something. You have something to enforce to be able to collect your rent. And now Kansas is opening back up and businesses are back, hiring their people back. And unemployment, although it was way delayed, is now working. So the dollars are there. This amendment is asking for 8 months or however many more months of free living for some people, and it's going to put a lot of people out of business that are in the rental business, a lot of small businesses. I'd ask you to think twice before supporting it. Thanks.
Representative Patton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, going back to the compromise we have with the governor's office and the Senate, this is one that was not discussed, but as you all know, and as the carrier of the amendment stated, the governor did allow this executive order to expire, I believe it was possibly even earlier this week or late last week. And in reading the quote from the governor's spokesperson, they indicated they were comfortable letting it expire at this time, and they will continue to monitor it over the coming weeks and months. And so, given the governor didn't think it was important to continue at this point in time, and she wants to continue monitoring it herself, I would encourage you to vote no on this amendment. Thank you.
Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I understand the concern about small landlords, and even large landlords. I think there are a lot of people who are going to be feeling pain. But I think that we're looking at a massive homelessness crisis if we don't address this topic. I really believe that landlords, small or large, have a more opportunity to work with their lenders to restructure their debt than most of their tenants do. So I think this is narrowly tailored to our existing circumstances, and really, if we don't want to see a lot of more of our fellow citizens out on the streets demanding more of our social service resources, I think we should approve this amendment, and I would encourage you to support it.
Seeing no further discussion, Representative, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I didn't know it was all right for us to discuss what people in other offices, be that the second floor or across the chamber, did. But I will say that I wouldn't have run this amendment without seeking approval from that office, and I did receive that approval. So I wouldn't have wanted to have derailed this any more than any of you would have. I want to give everyone an opportunity to, again, understand, knowing that we have taken those calls and those emails from people who have suffered from later than should have been paid PUA payments, that if you want to provide relief to those individuals, then vote yes, and if you don't, vote no. With that, I close, and I request a division and roll call vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You've heard the motion by Representative Clayton to amend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. Noes have it. Division has been requested. Roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, the clerk will open the roll. Has every member had the opportunity to vote? Has every member had the opportunity to record their vote? The clerk will close the roll. Does any member desire to change his or her vote? Seeing none, with 40 Representative Capps votes no. With 40 voted in favor, 76 against, the motion fails. We're back on the bill. Representative Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the work this body's done today. The committee has worked really hard as a whole. I will be. This is an easy discussion right now. We obviously have people hurting. We have people that are losing their jobs. We have folks that don't know the future. We have families that don't know if school's going to open up or not. Businesses are going to close. There's a lot of confusion. We've done a lot of work for companies. We've done a lot of work for property owners. Have we done work for individual Kansans, though? I ask you to ask yourselves that. Have we done things for just regular people? We've done work for the governor. We've done work for people with money. Let's talk about folks that just need a small break on their food sales tax. Let's see if we can reduce the food sales tax by $0.015, and also the amount that the internet sales tax is bringing in. This isn't new to anybody. This has been put through committees. It's been talked about amongst everybody. And so with that, I have an amendment.
Is there objection to waiving the reading of the amendment? See no objection. Representative may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment will only last the duration of the orders that have the sunset provisions. At the end of the amendment, I added at page 57, line 12, inserting, quote, "These provisions of the sales tax shall expire concurrently with the other sunset provisions contained in this bill." So it's not going to last indefinitely. There's also a reference in this bill on page 22, line 9, that discusses sales tax. I believe there are 2 points of contact here. Regardless of all the germanity, let's think about the humanity. As far as what is going to happen in folks' budgets, we need to give regular people a break. I think I've talked with most of you about this. You're all on board with this idea. Despite all of the fragility, we've seen commercials about the food sales tax being too high. It's 6.5%, the highest in the country. We have a pandemic. We have an economic recession for those at the bottom. And yet we make the cost of government placed on sales tax. Let me run through an exercise with you. If you have an average worker who pays a lot of money in their payroll tax, pays a lot of money in their property tax, pays a lot of money in their sales tax, pays even more money in their income tax, I would argue that 50% of their income goes to the government. Meanwhile, the richest among us, capital gains tax is low. There's no quote-unquote death tax. There's no high-income earner tax. When 50% of your income, most of your income goes back to the government, where's the socialism and communism at? I get these parties, we throw around these ideas about who's communist, who's socialist. Who is it? When you have a regular worker that's paying all of their money into the government, there's your communism, folks. And if you don't want to give these folks a break, you're guilty of being communists. It's true. You can laugh. It is somewhat funny. But it's ironic that most of our low-wage workers are paying most of their income into the government, or insurance, or health insurance that we don't give them. There's your communism. Give these folks a break, please. We've talked about this for 4 years. It's a penny and a half. It's during a pandemic. It's the end of the day. We've worked hard. Let's reward our voters. You can walk out of here and you can give everybody a stinking sales tax reduction, a tax reduction. We've talked about it for years. I move my amendment.
Representative Carpenter, Blake Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my comrade from Newton with his passionate speech. But I would say that I have voted on the sales tax reduction of food at least a dozen times, along with you, I would say, over the last several years. But at the end of the day, I do not think that this is germane to this bill, and so thus I will challenge the germaneness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Germanus has been challenged. The Rules Committee gather. Representative Finch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the body, the Rules Committee met and discussed the amendment. Again, we've talked about what the underlying bill does. The amendment reduces the food sales tax from 6.5% to 5% statewide. The reference made by the representative in the well to page 22, section 9, or line 9, is concerning a list of 38 things that counties cannot regulate or opt out of because counties don't have constitutional home rule in Kansas. This is only listed because the law requires that we list the totality of the section to be amended and not because the bill is doing anything to sales tax rates or restricting counties when it comes to retailer sales tax. Because of that, there are no points of contact between the bill and the amendment, and it is a unanimous opinion of the committee that the amendment is not germane.
Representative Hodge.
I appreciate it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. We were here the other night and we made the motion to suspend the midnight rule. Today we suspended, we've had debate against rules before, so I'm not really in the mood to play by the rules at this point, especially when I was told early on in my legislative career, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to work on the food sales tax that's the highest in the country. You're going to have a lot of opportunities to present these arguments, but that's not true. We had very few opportunities to do any of this. And so with that, I challenge the ruling of the chair.
The ruling of the ruling of the rules chair has been challenged. I'll remind the body this is a debatable motion and is only debatable by the following people: You can't find anybody? They don't have to. Representative Helgerson, Hodge, and Hawkins. Representative Helgerson.
Normally, I'm down here talking about the budgets, but I'm here to tell you that this is one thing we need to support, because if we support it, it'll be the last time we ever have to hear Tim Hodge talking about it this session.
Representative Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I asked the minority leader if he'd defend for me, and he declined. So, body, I think it's all been said. So, please just support our rules chair and sustain our rule chair ruling. Thank you.
Representative Hodge.
Again, Mr. Speaker, thank you. And thank you, body. It's been a great session. I've enjoyed being with you. I truly have. I know you may not be able to return the same feeling, but I enjoy being here with you. I enjoy making friends with you, despite our differences. However, I know this is something that we can unite on. I know it. I know we don't need to make the least of these pay the most amount of their monthly budget for taxes. I know we can give these folks a break. I know you can do this. Please support this, and please, with all due respect, override this ruling for the sake of regular Kansans, for the sake of regular folks that all vote for us, and we need to help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a reminder, a yes vote will sustain the ruling of the chair. A no vote will overturn the ruling. The question arises, shall the chairperson's ruling be sustained? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The division has been requested. The clerk will open the roll. Has every member had the opportunity to vote? The clerk will close the roll. 79 voted in favor and 35 against. The rules chair has been sustained. Back on the bill. Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment.
Wish to explain your amendment?
Mr. Speaker, at page 49 of the bill, line 38, on reviewing earlier, we have an extra word at line 38, and the amendment would be to strike the word of, which is the second word in line 38 of page 49. It was simply superfluous at that point in time.
Is there objection to waiving the reading of the amendment? Representative, you may continue.
This is simply a correction in the wording, and I would move my amendment.
Representative Hodge to speak to the amendment.
I challenge his germaneness. Withdrawn.
Any further discussion? Representative, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I close.
You for the motion, Representative Ralph. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Amendment carries. Back on the bill, Representative Patton. You may close.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Body, thank you for this debate and discussion we had today. As I started, when I said at the beginning, I think this is a good compromise bill. It allows for the governor to have day-to-day ability to manage the situation we're in now, but provides oversight, checks and balances for the legislative branch. I don't know about you, and I know we all come from different districts, but I'm hearing a lot out there about, will we just work together? And this does that. We've worked with the executive branch. I hope the Senate will continue to work with us when they debate this tomorrow. We have an agreement. I hope they live up to it and the governor fulfills her promise and signs the bill. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I close and move my motion.
This constitutes final action on House Bill 2016. The clerk will open the roll. You may record your vote. Has every member had the opportunity to record their vote? The clerk will close the roll. Does any member desire to explain his or her vote? Representative Sansel.
Body, I apologize you heard this first quote earlier, but for the people of Kansas, again, this is President Dwight D. Eisenhower. People talk about the middle of the road as though it were unacceptable. Actually, all human problems accepting morals come into the gray areas. Things are not all black and white. There have to be compromises. The middle of the road is all of the usable surface. The extremes, right and left, are in the gutters. This bill is not perfect, but it is the result of a better process and collaboration and difficult compromise. It is the middle of the road, which leads Kansas to 2021 to the stars through difficulties.
Does any other member desire to explain his or her vote? What? Representative Burris.
Mr. Speaker, I vote no on House Bill 2016. I support parts of this bill. However, COVID-19 emergency is not occurring and does not seem sufficiently likely to occur in Kansas. Also, through her prior exercise of emergency powers, the governor seriously damaged our state's economy. I therefore find it inappropriate to even limitedly approve and extend any of the governor's emergency proclamations. Further, the governor's blatant disregard for our religious freedoms expressly protected by Section 7 of the Kansas Constitution's Bill of Rights, through her mass gatherings, prohibitions causes me to question whether she'll respect limitations imposed on her by statute. Representative Burris.
Does any other member desire to explain his or her vote? Does any member desire to change his or her vote? Representative Eric Smith votes aye. Representative Curtis votes no. Further changes? Seeing none, 107 voted in favor and 12 against. The passes of House Bill 2016. The same having received a constitutional majority, the bill is hereby declared passed. The clerk will record the vote. Introduction of bills and concurrent resolutions. The clerk will read.
House Bill number 2017 by Representatives Holscher, Bishop, and others, an act concerning health and health care, enacting the Kansas Equal Access Act relating to medical cannabis, providing for the licensure and regulation of the manufactured, transportation, sale of medical cannabis. House Bill number 2018 by Representative Sawyer, an act concerning workers' compensation relating to occupational diseases. House Bill number 2019 by Representative Owsley, an act establishing the Office of the Child Advocate for Children's Protection and Services within the Department of Administration, prescribing certain powers, duties, and functions. House Bill number 2020 by Representative Owsley, an act concerning employment security law relating to disqualification for benefits, disqualification, begin dates, illness or injury, receipt of pension, or retirement pay, part-time employment for an educational institution, penalties during declaration of state of disaster emergency.
Are there announcements? Representative Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the House adjourn until Thursday, June 4th at 11 a.m.
You've heard the motion. Signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. We are adjourned.